Look, is it giving more Peaky Blinders than Sherlock? Maybe, but y'all cannot claim that we don't put in the work here over at Regency Rumors. Another day, another waistcoat. My husband wears a ton of these flat caps, so I have plenty to choose from and found one that matches one of my waistcoats, and I was like, this shall be worn for my Sherlock video. So, Sherlock Holmes is hot now, and you're like, I'm sorry, Sherlock Holmes has always been hot because of his mind, his directness, and his British quirks. Then you are my kind of people. However, this time around with the new Young Sherlock on Amazon Prime, he might be hot on purpose, as in we're intentionally leading with this Young Sherlock being hot. You will find him hot because he was in all of those teen romances, so he's hot now, okay? I'm definitely behind on the Young Sherlock craze, but I'm here now, and if there's one thing I've learned from making videos on period dramas, it's not to waste your time asking, do we need another one of these? There's like 20 adaptations of this. Again? Just don't waste your time thinking about it. Do we need another Sherlock Holmes anything? Nope. But here it is. And he's Gen Z, and he's got a posh British accent, so you will be satiated, whether you want it or not. In this video, we're breaking down our continual obsession with Sherlock Holmes, why he keeps changing with the generations, and whether or not a new Young Sherlock, manufactured for a Gen Z, potentially book talk romantasy audience, will be accepted by them. Welcome back to Regency Rumors. If you're new here, I'm Kayla, and here on the channel, I talk about period dramas, history, and historical fiction. And if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I am a hypocrite because I don't care if this is yet another version of Sherlock Holmes that we don't need, because I love a bit of Sherlock. I love Sherlock in any way it comes. I love the version of the Victorian era that Sherlock Holmes portrays in different adaptations. Most of the time, I find it so immersive, so engaging. I just want to live in one of those settings. I want to walk the foggy streets of London with him and smoke a pipe in a drawing room, probably filled to the brim with lead wallpaper. Okay, maybe I don't want to go back to the Victorian era, but you catch my drift. But how far can we push Sherlock and his side characters away from the original stories before it no longer feels like the games are afoot? Let's get to some historical detecting, historical deducing, historical yapping. It's 1887. Arthur Conan Doyle is 28 years old, sitting in a quiet medical practice in Portsmouth with an empty waiting room, trying to figure out his place in the world as a surgeon. Struggling to make ends meet, his mind drifts back a decade to his time as a student in the sterile, sharply lit wards of the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, remembering a man who is about to change the entire trajectory of his life, Dr. Joseph Bell. He was an acutely observant, methodical, and at times manic surgeon whom Doyle would learn a lot more from than just stitching up patients. Arthur Conan Doyle, during his tenure as a medical student from 1877 to 1881, served as a clerk to Dr. Joseph Bell, a surgeon whose diagnostic powers seemed to be that of kind of a mind reader. Before a patient even opened their mouth, Bell could rattle off their occupation, their recent travel history maybe, their deepest character traits, just by glancing at some mud on their boots or the calluses on their hands or a glance in a certain direction. Sound familiar? Sitting in his quiet office, Doyle took Bell's medical rigor and expansive knowledge and synthesized it into what we now know as the science of deduction. Coupled with a tall, thin frame, an energetic way of walking, and sharp, piercing eyes, Dr. Joseph Bell suddenly became London's most infamous Victorian detective. Well, detective of all time, really. This clinical background gave Sherlock Holmes a layer of grounded, professional authority and intelligence that shattered the mold of the bumbling gentleman amateurs of earlier mystery fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle described Sherlock Holmes in Study in Scarlet as, in height, he was rather over 6 feet, and so excessively lean that he seemed to be considerably taller. His eyes were sharp and piercing. Save during those intervals of torpor to which I have alluded, and his thin, hawk-like nose gave his whole expression an air of alertness and decision. Sherlock Holmes hit the Victorian public like a lightning bolt because of the chaoticness of Victorian-era society and the absolute state of real-life crime solving at the time. In the 1880s, the police force was still a relatively new concept, and forensics as we know them were virtually non-existent. Crime scenes were routinely trampled and unknowingly botched by well-meaning but entirely unscientific officers. The streets of London were plagued by disorder and unprosecuted violence, a terrifying reality that would soon culminate in the ultimate failure of law enforcement: Jack the Ripper butchering women in Whitechapel and simply vanishing in the fog. The public were terrified, and the police were completely out of their depth. Into this absolute chaos, Arthur Conan Doyle introduced a sure, if fictional, solution. By taking Dr. Joseph Bell's methodical clinical deduction and applying it to the streets of London, he gave Holmes a sense of cold, undeniable professionalism that real-life detectives at the time completely lacked. Even though we know, Holmes had other activities outside of his working hours he liked to do. By treating the messy, chaotic business of crime detection with the exact same rationality as a medical diagnosis, Doyle created an investigator who felt capable and able to catch a killer. The character of Holmes was in many ways an extension of Doyle's desire to see the disorganized business of detection reduced to an exact science, and in turn give a panicked public the comforting illusion of a man whose rationality could actually secure justice. While Sherlock Holmes has much more of a defined character than much older mythological ones in history, he's become somewhat of a moldable generational character in the way that he is reimagined and reinvented like characters such as Robin Hood. If you haven't seen that video, I talk about why we keep reinventing Robin Hood throughout the years, how his character evolved to match the fears and complaints of different time periods, and why we're seeking out a new Robin Hood yet again in today's cost of living crisis. These types of national figures serve as generational blank slates, essentially. While Robin Hood embodies the archetype of social rebellion and justice in the face of systematic corruption, Holmes represents the archetype of rational order and intellect winning over urban atrocities. Before you come for me for potentially not mentioning your favorite Sherlock Holmes adaptation in this video, Sherlock Holmes holds the Guinness World Record as the most portrayed human literary character, with over 25,000 adaptations across film, stage, and screen. So it is impossible to mention them all in this video, so please give me some grace. The cinematic history of Holmes began in 1900 with Sherlock Holmes Baffled, a 30-second sketch that introduced the detective to a medium that would cement his film fame. Early silent adaptations, such as those starring Ellie Norwood or John Barrymore, established the visual familiarity of Baker Street. Barrymore, in particular, emphasized the romantic aspects of the character, portraying him as a conventional leading man rather than a cerebral figure of the books. So it was during this period that the deerstalker hat and the curved pipe all became popular, which was not a part of Doyle's original text. So those are things that we've added on that then we just think are like Sherlock Holmes coded. It's so funny how this kind of thing happens, because I talked about that in my video on period dramas and like the myth of historical macho men about Vikings and gladiators, how the horned helmets are not at all historically accurate, but we associate them with Vikings now. There's no way of really separating Holmes with that hat, and honestly, I'm fine with it. Basil Rathbone remains for many the definitive Sherlock Holmes on screen for the early 20th century. His bold features and clipped delivery captured the detective's cerebral nature, while his physical presence worked well for some of the action sequences. The shift of these films to a contemporary 1940s setting allowed Holmes to engage in patriotic service, showing that the character could be uprooted from Victorian London without losing much of his essence. The 1980s saw a return to a more pure Doyle through the Granada television series starring Jeremy Brett. Brett's portrayal is widely considered the gold standard because of his commitment to the psychological complexity of the character. He refused to play Holmes as a cozy or sentimental figure, and instead wanted to embrace the contradictions that was found in Holmes's work, like his sudden cruelty and his intense focus and some of his manic energy. He compiled an 80-page Baker Street file that tracked every single detail from the books. So Holmes' specific mannerisms, his eating habits, and even some of his really dark vices, which is dedication to me. This level of meticulous detail reminds me so much of the devotion that David Suchet had for Poirot. I think that this kind of deep dive research is what makes a long-term character that someone plays over the years feel so much richer, and the adaptations stay popular over the years. I feel like somebody who dedicates years and years to their life to a particular character and puts in that amount of work deserves to be praised when it feels like people think that their version aligns with the author's in some way. Brett's version allowed for Sherlock not to be perfect or always heroic. He let Holmes be rude and obsessive and depressed sometimes, which is a much more layered character in my opinion. In the 21st century, the concept of the hot genius Sherlock has become a dominant theme in adaptations. This trend began with the BBC's Sherlock from 2010 to 2017, and millennials know what I'm talking about. This was our Sherlock, really. He was for the nerdy girls on Tumblr. Benedict Cumberbatch's portrayal popularized the sapiosexual appeal, the idea that intelligence is the primary driver of attraction. And that is my kind of hot, so I'm not mad about it. Cumberbatch's Sherlock was presented as kind of a high-functioning sociopath. While the character was often a massive a-hole to those around him, the audience empathized with his status as an outcast who was always right, even if he said it in abrupt ways. I talked a bit about this in my video, The Problem with Pretty Boys and Period Dramas, where I was speculating that it feels like fandoms had way more control back in the day to find characters like Cumberbatch's Sherlock sexy because they decided that collectively online, and that kind of grew the fandom, rather than it feeling as if it was far more manufactured for some shows and films through heavy-handed questions and marketing and PR campaigns to kind of will the people to find characters attractive or manufacture chemistry between two leads. Despite Cumberbatch being picked for Sherlock, the BBC were worried before the show ever aired that he was in no way sexy enough to play Sherlock. And then, surprise, surprise, scores of young girls on Tumblr, may or may not have been me included, fell in love with him anyways. And they were like, he's distant, but he's super smart. I love him. He wasn't a traditional leading man, but he redefined hotness for a new generation. He made smart the new sexy. People loved him because his brain was the most powerful thing on screen. Now we have a new Sherlock on the scene, a younger, more dapper version with the first season of Amazon's Young Sherlock. I want to start this section by saying I watched the show and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'll be honest, I was a little concerned about the casting at first. I haven't exactly been a fan of the after series that Hero Finds Tiffin is known for, but then again, that might just be me being an old lady, as those films are not in my demographic anymore. I couldn't keep up with all the titles. After we loved, before we fell in love, after this, after that. after I take a nap. However, he really grew on me in this. It didn't quite feel like that like lightning in a bottle casting we saw with Benedict Cumberbatch, where you felt like absolutely no one else could have brought that specific energy to this role. That's just my opinion. That being said, because this is a Sherlock who is still finding his feet, I actually found Hero's more like whimsical, youthful, and fun performance to be really refreshing and entertaining. What I'm about to dive into next isn't necessarily my personal opinion, but I think it's an interesting conversation to have, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below. The first season revolves around a single serialized mystery involving stolen Chinese documents and a murdered professor in Oxford, where Sherlock is sent to live under the watchful eye of his brother, not as a student, but a servant, which I think was a fun way to knock Sherlock down a peg or two. I thought that was really clever. It definitely leans into Guy Ritchie's more bare-knuckle, swashbuckling version of the Victorian era. If you didn't know, he also directed the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock films, but I don't think this was meant to be a prequel in any way to that. I think they are meant to be separate things. This feels just as fast-paced as those at times, but it's definitely less dark in tone to those films. Early responses to Young Sherlock have been divided. While some people have said that they appreciate the like fun, action-packed detective drama side of things, the energy of the action scenes, others found it to be like a shallow prequel that rests its laurels on the Sherlock Holmes brand. It also received criticism for what many people perceive as manufactured hotness. Unlike previous versions where the actor's physical appeal was a byproduct of their intellectual performance, Hero finds Tiffin was seen by some critics as being cast primarily for his appearance and pretty boy image. In these newer adaptations, like the Robert Downey Jr. films and this new Young Sherlock, they've been critiqued for having these investigations turn into like James Bond thrillers where the action sequences and the explosions become more important than the crime solving. Some critics have noted that while Cumberbatch made audiences see him thinking through on-screen mind palaces, the new version's deductions feel unmemorable and shallower in some way. Now, I actually enjoyed this. It felt reminiscent of the Sherlock Holmes games, which I have always felt were really fun. I have played several of them, and that kind of placing of characters before the scenario happens feels really immersive to me. The series uses a visually inventive method to portray Sherlock's thought process, referred to as his brain attic, where he steps into manipulatable memories to inspect crime scenes and look at clues. The show also relies on Ritchie's signature tropes, so like slow motion action, people in like tweed trousers punching each other, and kind of a faint steampunk aesthetic. For some, this has left them having a shaky believability of Hero finds Tiffin being this like genius Sherlock Holmes, as his believability is tied directly to the audience's belief in his brain. If his brain is sidelined for like manufactured appeal, the character ceases to be Holmes and becomes just another generic action figure in tweed. One of the reasons I believe that the intellectual hotness of the past, like Cumberbatch, felt a bit more authentic and less manufactured was that slow burn phenomenon driven by the fandom rather than a more like top-down marketing strategy. When an adaptation like Young Sherlock attempts to make the character a more like upbeat and boyish type, a bit cheeky and as if he would be one of the popular kids in school, it might risk erasing a potential neurodivergent subtext or a character who simply doesn't fit in with his peers, which is what can make the character feel real and relatable to modern audiences. A believable Sherlock must be a man at times at odds with the social norms of his world, not an overly charming hero who fits seamlessly into action sequences. When you pair that with like the edgy score, I also feel like the score of this is very reminiscent of House of Guinness, where it's historical-ish, but it's got a modern tempo and it's meant to feel edgy. And they're like, hey, this music, it's also meant to tell you that this is cool. This is a cool show. It makes it feel as if the series was more concerned with being vibey than being unique. I was just watching Cranford the other day, which is I think a 2006 adaptation, and the dialogue and the storytelling and the music really holds up. This is the first time I've seen it in probably 10 or 15 years, and I'm like, this feels like it could have been made yesterday, to be honest. Whereas I do wonder if some of these adaptations that lean into very contemporary sounds might feel dated after time. So, like similar to those 80s period dramas that have those synthesized sounds to them. I'm thinking of like Northanger Abbey. And there's just a level of cheesiness to it because it's got that very like 80s vibe to it with the types of music that they've put in, which I'm not saying it's a bad thing. In a way, it can make those old adaptations a bit iconic, but it is very much of a time. Whereas I do think there are plenty of adaptations that hold up better when they don't lean so heavily into whatever was currently exciting at the time. What I do genuinely find annoying, however, is how these types of castings can feel like they are trying to force a particular view upon us about this character compared to versions in the past. Hero finds Tiffin's casting in Young Sherlock is a prime example of marketed appeal. His uncles, Ray and Joseph Fiennes, are acting legends, and the industry's reliance on legacy casting often trumps the need for a unique new bet. I feel like sometimes hotness can be a measurable metric of marketability used to capture a younger demographic. For some people online, they see this as an attempt to sell an up-and-coming celebrity rather than a character. Now, I do feel like all of this is unfair to Tiffin, because irregardless of his performance, because of the massive impact Book Talk has had on promotional campaigns for film and TV and the constant questions around hotness and chemistry, etc., that seem to plague so many promo tours, that his hotness and appeal to a Gen Z audience would have 100% be factored in with the decision-making of a new Young Sherlock. And not to say that in most past productions, what leads look like have not been factored in, and people wanting to think about their attractiveness for shows. But with Sherlock in particular, I don't feel like that has been the leading thing. And in a lot of ways, we feel like that's a bit refreshing, right? That when we see Sherlock, the main thing about him is not that he's this Jim Bro heartthrob or something. It's that his intellect is what's most attractive about him. And so I'm not saying that Hero Finds Tiffin is doing a bad job with this performance, but what I am saying is that it's indicative of a wider cultural conversation around the need to cast certain types of people because they are trying to pull in a Book Talk audience. What I might agree with that's been talked about online is that Tiffin might be outshined by his sidekick in this, which is never what you want for Sherlock. So for this series, they have Sherlock's sidekick as a young Moriarty that he meets in Oxford, played by Donald Finn. And if you have watched my other Bennett sister video, y'all know my thoughts on Donald Finn. We are going crazy for him. He is our new period drama boyfriend, y'all. In this, he is so charismatic. He's cheeky. He's a little bit soulful, like... Y'all, I see this as kind of a Loki situation where the audience is far more in love with the baddie than they are with who is supposed to be the hero. I think there is a really fascinating and potentially accidental subversion happening here with the character of Moriarty. By making him this orphaned, working-class genius who has fought for every scrap of recognition while Sherlock is insulated by his own privilege and family name, the show has inadvertently created a much more compelling protagonist in the antagonist. Donald Finn brings such a raw, magnetic intensity to the role that he honestly feels like the true leading man of the story. Like, I'm not trying to be mean, but like I fear that could be the reality, at least in my mind, and several other people online's minds as well. In our mind palaces. You know what I mean? Some people say it's hard to buy into the idea that these two are intellectual equals when Moriarty is constantly outshining Sherlock. I do personally think, though, some of the backlash is a step too far. For a series that is specifically focused on a young Sherlock who is still finding his feet, I think critics are asking a lot out of this character to be the fully formed, sometimes aloof genius that we meet at Baker Street. We have to allow for a version of Sherlock that is still a bit raw and immature and messy and boyish and human. I saw nothing inherently wrong with Hero Finds Tiffin's performance, nor was it so out of bounds that it lost its ties to the source material. To me, seeing a Sherlock who is struggling to control his own intellect feels like a legitimate origin story. Was I blown away by this version of Sherlock Holmes? No. But neither was I appalled or devastated that it was somehow a terrible adaptation. It's simply a different flavor, a Guy Ritchie tinted lens that favors the kind of bare-knuckle energy of the 1870s over the more intellectual, cerebral adaptations that I tend to prefer. I find myself genuinely torn on this adaptation. On the one hand, there is a noticeable lack of originality at times. And I am personally so over the book talk tactics that studios use to sell these series. I do not need another video of British people, Irish people, European people eating American potato chips. Like, I don't need another one to sell a show if it's really good. However, those kinds of things are not the actors or the director's decision. It's a studio level push for that type of marketing, and it has no bearing on whether or not a show is actually good. As Guy Ritchie's Young Sherlock shows, productions are frequently designed to deliver something similar to a popular property. So it's a safe bet for a studio, even if it feels a bit unoriginal to those of us looking for something a bit deeper. I think the performances are great, and Guy Ritchie truly knows how to craft a visually appealing, vibrant Victorian world. I think these types of dramas should be visually enjoyable, not just another grayscale show that's gonna make you feel depressed. So I personally enjoy his version of the Victorian era. Ultimately, not every show has to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes a series can be fun and action-packed and fueled by a popular soundtrack without it being a disaster for the genre. And like, obviously, Sherlock Holmes is going nowhere. I think we as an online community have become a bit snobbish about what we find acceptable when it comes to new adaptations. This show existing and people finding genuine joy and cleverness in it doesn't take away from any of the Sherlock adaptations of the past. Those stories are still there for us to read and watch. It's okay for Sherlock, the most adapted character in history, who is in no way going away, to be a fun, like, swashbuckling ride sometimes. So, it is now 1893. The quiet medical practice in Portsmouth is a memory, and the empty waiting rooms have been replaced by the relentless, thundering success of the Strand magazine, which distributes Sherlock's wildly popular stories. Arthur Conan Doyle is no longer a struggling surgeon. He is a literary superstar, but he feels like a man in a gilded cage. To the outside world, he's seen as this literary genius, but he was wanting for his historical works to be taken more seriously, and all the public wanted from him was Sherlock Holmes. In December of that year, Doyle takes his detective to the sheer mist-soaked cliffs of the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland. He has Sherlock and Moriarty locked in a final desperate embrace, and then he just sends them straight over the edge. Doyle kills Sherlock, and then he's convinced that now he's finally free to write the great British novel he was born to write, not knowing that he'd already done that. The moment those words were written on page, that Sherlock Holmes was dead, the reaction was unlike anything the literary world has seen before or will see again, I think. More than 20,000 people canceled their subscriptions to The Strand in a single month, which is a lot of people back then. The magazine nearly collapsed under the weight of the Victorian cancellation of Arthur Conan Doyle. He was called a murderer. He was begged and threatened and implored to undo the dreadful event. Doyle held out for 8 long years, which I had no idea that it was that long that he left Sherlock Holmes dead. Could you imagine an author getting that level of backlash today and not folding into the pressure within like a week or a couple of months? Crazy. But he eventually realized a truth that every storyteller has had to learn over time, I think, which is sometimes characters get too big for their creators. Like Robin Hood, Sherlock Holmes kind of turns into a bit of a mythical character in the sense that now he belongs as much to the audience as he did to the person that made him up in the first place. We shape him into what we need in uncertain times. In 1893, a Victorian public facing the dizzying speed of the Industrial Revolution needed a man who could decode all the chaos that was going on and give them certainty when there was none. I think the reason we keep seeing these new versions through the years is because Sherlock has become a figure for us in this post-truth era. We're living through an environment defined by information overload and the erosion of objective reality, and we are desperate to believe that the world is still decodable through the sheer application of logic. There is something so comforting in a character who has the ability to find out the absolute truth. I don't know if Gen Z loves or wants this new Young Sherlock Holmes series. Sometimes it feels like these things are made for a new generation, but with them having almost no say in the matter. We end up with writers creating cringy dialogue that they think 20-somethings use and trends that they hope will work on screen, but that actually fall flat. Every now and then, this gamble results in a masterpiece that defines a generation, however. As we look towards the future of the Sherlock Holmes brand, I think we're seeing some really telling shifts in what audiences and fan communities are actually looking for. There is a move away from the narcissistic sociopath trend that has dominated the last decade or so. People are hungry for a Sherlock who is smart and a bit more kind, someone whose brilliance doesn't require him to be a jerk to everyone in the room. Adaptations like Sherlock & Co. that explicitly frame Holmes as neurodivergent are gaining huge traction. It's an empowering, relatable way to see his character without reducing his entire personality down to a disability. Whether he's a bare-knuckle action hero for a new generation or a quiet, neurodivergent scholar in a podcast, Sherlock Holmes is the mirror that we hold up to our own fears. Arthur Conan Doyle eventually had to bring him back because the world refused to let him stay dead. And so, as long as there is a mystery to solve or truth to be found, Sherlock will be there, stepping out of the London fog and into the light, ready to deduce the world for us in whatever way we need him next. Well, that is it for me, guys. What did you think of the series Young Sherlock? Do you think there has been an intentional casting of hotness? I think it's very split online. I think a lot of people are like, no, he was just cast because he's young and he's a good actor. Some people are like, he's been cast in this because he's just pretty. I feel like two things can happen at once. I do not know if you guys know this, but Christopher Plummer once played Sherlock Holmes, and that is a casting where there was a mix of smartness and hotness. Thank you very much. He was in a film called Murder by Decree, where he played Sherlock Holmes. And if you can imagine a young Christopher Plummer in a deer sucker hat, there's been a lot of like TikTok edits going around of him like shredding that flag in The Sound of Music, and like just there being a resurgence of women being like, oh, he is such a pretty man and been slept on for years as him being a heartthrob. Like, obviously, Christopher Plummer has been a famous actor for a long time, but just like never been seen as like huge heartthrob status. And people are like, why not? Why hasn't he been seen in this way? And let me tell you, if you are bored and want to go do some searching, how about you look up Christopher Plummer as Sherlock Holmes? You're welcome. Okay, bye.